This is Basic History on World War I. Let's start with a little recap. On the Western Front, the Allies and Germans faced each other in trenches stretching from the coast all the way to Switzerland, launching attacks at each other across no man's land. In the east, Russia had stumbled disastrously at the beginning of the war against Germany at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, but it successfully regrouped and managed to repulse a German attack on Warsaw, while further south had managed to smash through Austrian lines, take Galicia, and had 100,000 Austro-Hungarian troops under siege in Przemysl. The Austrians had also been forced back in Serbia, who successfully retook their capital and country, but took enormous losses to do so. The Ottomans had declared war and were moving to attack Russia in the Caucasus and Britain in Egypt. And in the skies above France, and in the and under the seas of the world, the war continued to expand. First, we go to Great Britain for a new first in the war: aerial bombing of civilians. On the 19th of January, the first Zeppelin raid occurred, with bombs falling on Yarmouth, King's Lynn and Sheringham. In January, we also had the naval battle of Dogger Bank, where the Royal Navy beat the German High Sea Fleet, but due to miscommunications failed to deliver a decisive blow. Another critical part of the naval war fell into place in January when the Kaiser announced unrestricted submarine warfare. From here on out, any ship thought to be supplying Great Britain could and would be targeted by German U-boats, who were already causing serious damage to the British Empire, sinking many tons of vital supplies. On the Western Front, the massive Champagne offensive, which France had launched in December, came to an end only in March 17th, after suffering over 90,000 casualties for little ground gained. German losses were around 45,000. The French commander Joseph Joffre had a problem, however, as the Germans currently occupied the French industrial heartland, and so further attacks would be launched, mostly without result, throughout 1915. In the east, the Austro-Hungarian Empire launched a winter offensive in the Carpathian Mountains in an attempt to relieve the garrison at Przemysl. This would fail, with thousands of men freezing to death in the mountains. They would actually launch 3 such offensives at the cost of 800,000 casualties for no reason, as the fortress would fall in March with 125,000 prisoners taken. While further north, the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes was fought, and once again the Germans routed the Russian army and had them retreating in complete disarray. The Russians had more fortune in the Caucasus, where Enver Pasha, Ottoman Minister of War, launched a disastrous winter offensive that led to no ground gained and effectively destroyed an entire Ottoman army. The same man who had almost single-handedly led his country to war had now also led tens of thousands of men to their death. Needing a scapegoat, he turned Turkish ire on the Armenian minority, which would lead to the Armenian genocide, where between 600,000 to 1.5 million Armenians were killed. Turkey does not recognize the genocide to this day. The Ottomans also launched an attack on the Suez Canal. Their plan relied heavily on surprise, but the British were well informed thanks to reconnaissance aircraft, which were already starting to play a massive role in this war. We also had the first mutiny here in 1915 with Indian troops in Singapore. This was actually supposed to coincide with a general Sikh uprising across India, but the revolt was betrayed by a police spy. The ringleaders were all rounded up and shot or hung. This would not be the last mutiny of the war. First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, Winston Churchill, yes, that Winston Churchill, had a plan to break the deadlock, sailing French and British battleships up the Dardanelles, destroy the Ottoman defences, threaten Istanbul and link up with the Russian Black Sea Fleet for a drive up the Danube into Hungary. However, 5 of the 10 battleships were destroyed in a single day, and the plan was called off. The forts would instead be taken by landing army troops on the peninsula of Gallipoli. When we last saw Serbia, they had successfully drove back the Austrians in December. Things had been quiet since then on the front lines, but suffering continued as a typhus epidemic swept the nation, with some 30,000 people dying. Their doctors were the worst affected, with 126 out of only 350 in the entire country dying. Starting in March, there were also border clashes with Bulgaria, who were friendly with the Central Powers. Little Serbia, whose invasion by their imperialistic and aggressive neighbour had started this whole war, continued to suffer immensely. Its only real solace at this moment being the Austrians were itself too weak to attack them. On April 22nd, the month-long Second Battle of Ypres began, an offensive by the Germans to capture the tactically important Ypres salient. This is the first time in the war that poison gas was used, as the Germans released chlorine gas on Allied lines. The Germans would be the most prolific user of gas during the war, but all sides would resort to using this horrific and vile weapon by war's end. Just another way to kill thousands of men quickly. Down in the Ottoman Empire, on April 25th, one of the most infamous battles of the war started, as Allied troops landed on Gallipoli. The plan had been to land on two beaches, crush the Ottoman forces between them in a hammer and anvil manoeuvre, and then seize Istanbul and force the Ottoman Empire out of the war. But incompetent leadership, such as landing the Anzac, which are the Australian and New Zealand troops, at the wrong beach, and the inspired leadership of Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, on the Ottoman side, made sure the Allies never even cleared the peninsula. The Anzac troops especially would fight incredibly well, and this is where they would begin developing their excellent reputation as fighting troops. But despite this, and the constant flow of reinforcements, Gallipoli would turn into a bloody fiasco, where thousands would die in a hopeless venture. America under Woodrow Wilson was neutral, with its citizens firmly against getting involved in a European war, which, yeah, good call, honestly. However, opinions started to harden against Germany after a U-boat sunk the SS Lusitania on May 7th. 1,193 people would die in the sinking. 124 of those were Americans. And this caused outrage in the US and brought condemnation down on the German Empire for its use of unrestricted submarine warfare. Another neutral country was Italy, who was being courted by both sides with promises of territorial expansion. After the thrashing of Austria-Hungary by Russia and the Gallipoli landings, Italy decided to side with the Allies and declared war on Austria-Hungary on May 26, 1915. Despite seeing the cost of modern war from up close, Italy's leaders still decided to do it. Pure hubris from men who would never be in any danger or fight any battles, sending more thousands of young men to die. When we last visited the Eastern Front, the Austrians were on the ropes. After 3 failed winter offensives and the fall of the fortress of Przemysl, they had fallen back to Hungary, and the Russians were bearing down on them from the Carpathian Mountains. Luckily for Austria, the Germans arrived in the nick of time to staunch the bleeding and begin to slowly push the Russians back, first into Galicia and then back to the San River and recently captured Przemysl. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been saved, but was now firmly under the thumb of their German allies. On June 23rd, the Italians launched the first Battle of the Isonzo, trying to break through Austrian lines. This would fail. The Italian army was poorly trained and badly equipped, especially low on modern artillery, and were attacking well-defended mountain positions. This was the brainchild of Italian Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna, another inept general whose pride and vanity would lead to the deaths of tens of thousands of his own countrymen. On July 9th, German Southwest Africa fell to South African troops, while on the same week British and French leaders met in Calais and agreed to further autumn offensives. On the Western Front itself, the bloody stalemate continued, with the Second Battle of Ypres giving way to the Second Battle of Artois, but in effect, it remained the same as always, suffering huge losses for small gains all along the front. In the east, the Russians had been getting battered by the massive phalanx of Field Marshal August von Mackensen, a force of 500,000 Austro-German troops and 2,000 big guns. This unstoppable force had pushed the Russians out of all the territory they had captured from Austria and back into their own lands. Also facing pressure around Warsaw, the Russian High Command made a monumental decision. They would pull back, launching a massive retreat all along the line, giving up Poland and all of Galicia, burning everything behind them in a scorched earth policy and driving a great exodus of civilians ahead of them. Russia would have 3.3 million refugees by the end of the year. This retreat would work to shorten the Russian front line and save them from encirclement and destruction, but at terrible cost. Between 13th of July and the 28th of August, Russia suffered over 1 million casualties. It would never truly recover from these losses, and its morale would sink dangerously low from this point on. Also in August, the Fokker Scourge began over the skies of the Western Front, as a German Fokker Eindecker plane, with its interrupter gear preventing its machine guns from shooting its own propeller, began to take a terrible toll on Allied pilots, who began to call their own planes Fokker fodder. On the 5th of September, Tsar Nicholas II took personal command of the Russian army and left the Tsarina Alexandra and Rasputin in control of Petrograd, which would lead to no negative consequences at all. On the 25th, the Battle of Loos began on the Western Front. This would be the first time the British used poison gas, but this would not help them gain victory, and they would suffer 50,000 casualties for no ground gained. The French also launched the Second Battle of Champagne and the Third Battle of Artois at this time, with similar disastrous results. The British had more success in the Middle East, where General Townsend, one of Britain's better leaders, had taken Kut on the road to Baghdad and had now advanced some 600 miles. On October 11th, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and attacked Serbia with 300,000 men. This coincided with an attack from the north by Austro-German troops under August von Mackensen, who had just spent the summer beating the brakes off Russia and Galicia. 20,000 French and British troops landed in Salonika in neutral Greece and moved to the Greek-Serb border to attempt to help their Balkan ally. This they would fail to do, and Serbia would fall on November 24th, with the remnants of the Serbian army fleeing into Albania. On the 18th of October, the Third Battle of the Isonzo began, which, just like the previous two, achieved very little in the mountain terrain, and would be called off on the 4th of November with some 80,000 Italian casualties. On the 18th of December, the first evacuations from Gallipoli began. From the 500,000 Allied men deployed in this campaign, a third were now casualties. Turkish casualties were even greater, for a campaign which had failed almost as soon as it started. There would be no Christmas truce this year, no friendly game of football, just fighting all over the world, continuing unabated and with no end in sight. Join us next year as we bring the Great War into 1916.